All good to go? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Set. Sorry. Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started. Yeah. Thank you all for choosing this of the 15 sessions that are going on right now. And welcome to a live recording of the Fuel to Fork podcast from the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Here we find out whether it's feasible to phase out fossil fuels from our future food and farms. I've had a lot of practice saying that sentence over the last year. So I'm Matthew Kessler, podcast host and science communicator, working with Table, where we explore the evidence, values, and visions that shape the future of food. This Fuel to Fork project has been a collaboration between Table, IPES Food, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and Global Alliance for the Future of Food. It has been a pleasure working with these organizations, and a huge thanks to the Oxford Real Farming Conference. So we're going to split this session in two halves. The first will be a panel discussion among us with the brilliant panelists who I will introduce shortly. And the second half, the last 45 minutes, is going to be with the audience. So we really want to hear from you. There's a lot of interesting life experience and expertise in this room to tackle this question of phasing out fossil fuels in our food. We talk about climate a lot. We talk about biodiversity. We talk about the health impacts of the food system. But we don't always link that to the fossil fuel inputs that go into food. And that's what we're specifically tackling here and what we've been doing throughout the podcast series. And it's been a really revealing experience. So we will have questions from everyone in this room, from the online audience, and you will find Robbie and Jackie. So I'll give a signal and you'll raise your hand and we'll call on you. So first, I just want to warm up a little bit and ask, what part of the food supply chain do you think is most dependent on fossil fuels? And because this is a podcast as well as a video, I'm going to ask if you cheer as well as raise your hand. So the options are on farms, across transportation, in processing and packaging, and in our kitchen and in our homes. So if you think fossil fuels on our farms is the most intensive use, give a shout or a cheer or raise your hand. On the farm. It's weird to cheer for fossil fuels, I know. If you think it's on transportation. Yeah, a little bit louder there, okay. And then in processing and packaging. No. Yeah, okay, slightly muted, but it's there. And then in our kitchen, in our homes, in also our retail sector. Yeah, so it is everywhere. You're all correct. We maybe have some podcast listeners that learned that it's revealed that processing and packaging actually makes up more than 40% of fossil fuel use in our farm. It's incredibly energy intensive in the ways that we produce our food. Bring the product of the food into retail stores, and this largely connects to diets and a lot of other things. So we're going to explore all that, and we're going to start with Rupert Simons, who leads Systemic's Nature Food team in Europe, engaging with major food and agribusiness companies aimed at supporting transitions to net zero and nature-positive business models. So Rupert, starting with you, can you tell us where fossil fuels are throughout the food system? If you could give us a journey throughout the supply chain.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Matthew, and Table Debates for inviting us. It's a real privilege to be here. I've tried to buy tickets for the last few years, and I always leave it too late, and then I'm left watching online, which is obviously less fun. So real privilege to be here. But I think your opening question, in a way, captures where we are with fossil fuels and food, which is that they're, in a sense, they're everywhere, but they're sometimes hidden. So obviously, diesel in tractors and trucks driving food around are relatively easy to identify. But as you pointed out, there's a very large amount of fossil fuels that are embedded in processing and packaging, around 40% of the total, that we don't necessarily think of as fossil fuel derived products or processes, but actually heating and processing mostly is powered by natural gas still, and plastic packaging is a petroleum product. It's a byproduct of the oil industry. So anything that is packaged in plastic or is processed with natural gas has got fossil fuels embedded in it. And then on the farm, not necessarily for everyone in this room, but across the world, the biggest emissions driver and the biggest fossil fuel component is the fertilizer. Very significant share of global fossil fuel consumption, particularly for natural gas, goes into fertilizers, especially nitrates, which you have to condense out of the air using a very energy-intensive process. And it is possible to do it with electricity, and when the process was invented, it was dominated by electricity, but as natural gas became cheap and widely available, natural gas took over, and so overwhelming majority of mineral fertilizers now are produced with natural gas, and that process is starting to change, but slowly, and global fertilizer demand is still rising. And then it's worth mentioning that sort of crop protection products, pesticides, again, maybe not everyone in the room's in that space, but there is a very significant fossil fuel component in there as well. So the short answer is everywhere, and then there is, of course, and this is it a fossil fuel? Slightly debatable whether land use change really counts as a fossil fuel. But let's just say when people start using biofuels as a partial substitute for fossil fuels, that's also driving land use change and land conversion, especially in South America and Southeast Asia. So some of the substitutes from fossil fuels might not be fossil fuels themselves, but still have land use change and emissions implications. The short answer is everywhere, but that doesn't mean that we're powerless about it, and there's lots we can do. So looking forward to unpacking that later.
Yeah, we will get into what a transition looks like, what are the barriers to transition, what are different supports, what are different pathways. We're going to get into all of that, but we're also now going to focus on where fossil fuels are on the farm, and we're very lucky to have Helen Browning, organic farmer and chief executive of the Soil Association, UK's leading charity for organic farming and healthy food systems. So Helen, you've been thinking about this question, where are fossil fuels on your farm? Have they increased or decreased over time? And interestingly, Rupert mentioned fertilizers, and I assume you don't have a fossil fuel footprint from nitrogen fertilizer on your farm, but where else might fossil fuels be?
Thank you, and great to be here too. I suppose to say for the first, to start with, that it's not only in the last 5 or 6 years that we've been properly carbon footprinting our own farming systems, and I suspect that's the same for a lot of farms. Some would have been ahead of the game, but I think we've only got really an evidence base over the last few years. But as you say, as an organic farmer, we turned our back on the nitrogen fertilizers and that kind of thing, and the pesticides, nearly 40 years ago. But we're still dependent on fossil fuels in a whole bunch of areas. I think where in a way, one of the challenges for us is that when we look at our carbon footprint as a whole, actually fossil fuels are a very small part of the picture. As a farm, we've transitioned from one system to another within the organic sector. But one of the challenges for us is obviously methane. So if we're looking at the total climate change impacts of farming, fossil fuels on an organic farm are quite a small proportion. And those have decreased over the last few years for us, partly as a result of us changing the way that we're doing the kind of things that we're doing on the farm. So we used to be doing more arable cropping, where we have more tractors running around using diesel. And in our livestock side of things, we were making more silage and more hay. So one of the things that particularly my daughter and her husband have brought into the farming system is this kind of much more extensive dairying system where we're only milking the cows once a day, so we've got less power being used for milking and for cooling, but also outwintering more of our cattle. So all we need to do is take a quad bike up onto the downs to kind of go and move the cows onto their new strips each day, rather than running around with feeders and silage and making a lot of silage, which is a very energy-intensive intensive thing to do, especially if you're wrapping it then in black plastic. So I think our system is very much evolving to be a very low fuel system because we're actually working with nature a lot more. We're planting more trees to give shade and shelter. We're trying to do all those kind of things which are actually reducing our need for diesel, because that's now where the majority of our challenge is. So that those kind of system change things, along with, we have to remember that a lot of the fossil fuels that we use are embedded in the things that we buy. So if you're buying a lot of kit, you've got a lot of embedded fossil fuels in your new tractors and all those kind of things. So again, I think we're very cautious, partly because we're always strapped for cash, but we're always running old bits of kit where our our embedded fossil fuel in those kind of things, as we should be doing across the whole of society. The more we make, do and mend, rather than keep buying new, the more we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And then I think in terms of some of the sort of more Scope 3 emissions, we now use far less feed that's coming in from elsewhere. When we had lots of pigs, we were bringing in feed, and there is embedded fossil fuel in that pig feed that's coming in inevitably, and we have never been able to fully quantify that because you're not able to often track back to exactly what farms that's coming from and that kind of thing. So I think, we are decreasing. For us, it is mostly about diesel. But in the bigger scheme of things, it's only one bit of the jigsaw in terms of our climate change impacts.
Thank you. And now we're going to bring in our last speaker, Emile Frison, a panel expert and co-founder of IPES Food, senior advisor to the Agroecology Coalition, and expert on agroecology and agricultural biodiversity. So, Emile, I want to ask you, what do you see as a promising opportunity to reduce fossil fuel dependence across our food system? I mean, there's different visions and pathways for what that could look like. Can you maybe paint us a picture of what an agroecological or territorial food system might look like in practice to have this fossil fuel-free transition?
Well, it really means a real transformation of the entire system. It's not just about looking at one particular aspect, but it's really thinking about reshaping the whole food system based on agroecological approaches that will tackle the issue from different fronts. We heard the fertilizer question. Just the nitrogen production is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire aviation worldwide. So that gives you an order of magnitude. And so getting rid of the use of synthetic nitrogen in particular is certainly a very significant step forward. Then other part of an agroecological transformation is certainly changes in practices like reduced this soil disturbance. Tillage is certainly the most energy consuming practice on a farm, so reduced or no tillage is one of the aspects that reduces this. But we should also look at the downside on getting closer to the consumers, having shorter value chains, a greater diversification also to reduce risk, but that has also implications on the creation of synergies between different species in a system that makes the system more efficient. So I think it's really looking at reshaping the entire food system rather than just focusing on one particular approach only. That's how we can do that. And as you mentioned, the landscape approach, it's not just looking at individual farms, but also at how we can transform a landscape and creating mutual, I would say, synergies between different cattle farms with horticultural production, for example, the kind of relationships that can make the whole system more efficient. So I think this systemic approach of looking at the entire food system and all the aspects where we can gain efficiency, but also really think in terms of broad transformation.
And the question that we're asking on this panel is a fossil-free food system possible? I think possible is an interesting word here, because then we could talk about what are the economic realities, what are the political realities, what are the technical challenges of electrifying tractors and the batteries that go into them. So I want to open this up to think about to kind of center on this idea of what's possible and think about this kind of broad scale transformation and what needs to get there, and also think about what does more of an industrial, large scale fossil free food system look like as well. So Rupert, could you maybe lay out a pathway of what would this kind of large scale, efficient fossil free food system look like?
Thank you, Matthew. And just to give some context for folks who maybe haven't heard of Systemic, so we're business consultants. We're also analysts and researchers. So we work with industry on pathways to decarbonization, especially on Scope 3 emissions. But we also serve as an advisor and analyst to think tanks and to coalitions. And one of them is the Energy Transitions Commission, which we've worked on for the last 8 years. And with them, we wrote a roadmap to how a fossil fuel-free world can be possible by 2050. So what would it take? What technologies would we need? And what sort of system and behavioral changes would you need to have a fossil fuel-free economy by 2050? And a large part of the answer is actually in demand reduction and demand management. So wasting less and where it's possible in the context of a growing population, consuming less. But there is also some need, obviously, given that the population is still growing in much of the world and the people who get richer want to eat more and more diverse food. You also have to acknowledge there will be some parts of the world where large-scale intensive production will continue, and some it will even increase because of climate change. So parts of the world that are currently fertile and suitable for farming will become less so because of a combination of droughts, floods, and in some cases just the extreme heat making it difficult for plants and animals to survive. And so we do think that there will be some industrial decarbonization measures as part of that mix. So for those who continue to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, shifting to making those from electrolysis of water, which uses electricity rather than natural gas. And that is going to be most effective in those parts of the world that have abundant renewable energy resources. So on the train up here, I was looking at where are the ammonia plants that are shifting to renewable electricity, and actually a lot of the investments right now are going into parts of Africa and the Middle East, where, yes, natural gas has historically been quite cheap, but actually now renewables are also quite cheap because of the collapsing cost of solar power. So Namibia, for example, is building a green ammonia plant that can then export fertilizer to South Africa. Then there's the system change point that Emile has started mentioning. So that's about how you can change the farming system to, for example, integrate livestock with crops, and thus you can use more organic fertilizer. You don't need as much of the synthetic, and that's linked to the demand management point. Because if we're using a lot of land to grow feed for pigs and chickens, then that is land that can't be used to grow feed for humans. And if we're using a lot of land for biofuels, to replace the diesel with biodiesel, that's good on the one hand because there's less fossil fuel, but it's also problematic because that is land that could be used for other things. And the supply of land, of course, is finite. And there is some deforestation, particularly in South America, for biofuels. So we have to be a bit careful of some of these intermediate steps, biodiesel and so on, that are quite easy to do in the short term. They're sort of plug and play, whether your tractor doesn't care if it's biodiesel or fossil diesel, but are not long-term part of the solution because of the heavy use on land. And so there's a set of technologies, green ammonia, demand management, demand reduction, waste reduction, that are essentially possible and feasible with today's technologies. Some of them are more expensive, but they're coming down in price. And then there's some technologies that aren't quite there yet, but are sort of round the corner. And electrification of transport is one of those. So obviously you can get electric cars, Electric trucks and tractors are not quite there yet, partly because the batteries are very heavy. And I think the answer to that is twofold. I mean, one is ongoing investments in battery technology and making the batteries lighter and cheaper. But the other part is automation, because automation allows you to have smaller vehicles. And so rather than one big tractor, you end up with 2 or 3 smaller ones, but they're automated, and so they don't need to be as heavy. And so whilst, yes, you've got a battery, there's less soil compaction associated with that. And it'd be interesting to hear from the conversation later if anyone's got experiences in this, if anyone's tried already electrifying some of the processes on farm. The last thing I'll mention is on the process and packaging side. Matthew mentioned at the beginning, something like 40% of the emissions and fossil fuel use in the system come from process and packaging, much of which is off farm. It's in food processing plants, it's in plastic. All of that can be decarbonized, and actually with existing technologies. So with plastic, it's about reuse models, it's about fermentation, it's about, in some cases, bioplastics, which are less land intensive than biofuels because you don't need as many tons to make the plastic. But in the processing side, you don't need super high temperatures for food processing. Most industrial food processing plants are running at temperatures of sort of 150 to 200 degrees C, and high temperature heat pumps are already in operation that can decarbonize that entirely. We had a client in the United States who, quite a cynical corporate, if I'm being honest. They're interested in the bottom line. They're not particularly motivated by fighting climate change. They got a $50 million grant from the US government under the Inflation Reduction Act to take gas out of their factories and replace it with heat pumps. That wasn't a climate decision, that was a commercial decision. Not all countries can afford to subsidize it like the US, but the technologies are there, and they are going to get cheaper because as fossil fuels become scarcer and more expensive, the electric alternatives become progressively more attractive.
I really I'm really, I guess, always struggling with this, 2050, 2070, 2030 plans that always feel kind of far away, and the kind of need for immediate action, but also that when you do these immediate disruptions, not everyone, people, farmers can fall through the cracks, right? Like, not everyone is necessarily cared for in these transitions. So I'm curious to hear from the farmer perspective, Helen, who stands to win and lose in these transitions? What are some things we should be thinking about when, right? It sounds very nice. Let's just remove all the fossil fuels. But what does that look like? How does that look like for you on your farm in practice?
Well, I think on the farm at the moment, you are very dependent on other sectors getting their act together, on us decarbonising the grid, for instance, or being able to develop the kind of, whether they're robotics, as you've just mentioned, or conventional tractors that will run on electricity or on other sustainable fuels. So in a way, we're slightly helpless until some of those bigger changes happen. And that's the same for a lot of society. I mean, that's why the decarbonisation of the grid is such an enormously important project, because we all depend on that electricity, because electricity can be produced from fossil fuels as well, coming from green sources. So, but looking at some of the potential wins and the win-wins, actually, because that's what I'm always really interested in. This idea of, we can shift our processing and distribution systems to be more efficient, as we've just heard, and to run differently. But how about if we really remodeled our food system and shortened those supply chains and delivered fresher, whole foods to people rather than actually depending on this very big processing industry, which is undermining our health and causing a huge amount of problem elsewhere. So I'd love us to be really creative and think, how do we tackle a number of the challenges that society faces together, and try and find ways of making those shorter supply chains really work, because at the moment they are inefficient largely, and for fresh food, where you do need to get stuff to people quickly before it goes off, how do we actually manage that stuff really well? Now, I think this is a really complex world we're walking into, so it's really hard to predict exactly how it's going to play through, which technologies are going to be found to be really sound. And certainly as a farmer, when I'm thinking about what energy, should I be investing in renewables on my farm now? And if so, where should I start? Because we could put up solar panels, or we could try and get a wind turbine, or we could be looking at things like AD, or I'm really interested by some of these technologies about capturing methane from slurry and being able to turn that into gas, which could run our tractors. Is that a more viable option than electrification for our farm machinery? And I don't know the answers to all of these because the technologies are emerging really fast. I don't know which ones are going to be winners, and that's where I think as farmers we really need some help in terms of picking our way through what is likely to be the sensible thing to do, because some of these things sound like great ideas and then you realize you're going down a bit of a dead-end street on them, and we find that we've got challenges that we didn't quite recognize at the outset. So I think really thinking through what's the right routes for farms and for the rest of the food sector, how do we get those win-wins built in from the start? How do we not just tackle one slice of the problem, but tackle the whole problem in a more holistic kind of way? That's where my head's at, and I don't have all of the answers.
Emile, do you have anything to add there on the who stands to win and lose?
I'd like to bounce back on this idea of really whole system transformation, not just thinking in terms of substitution. And I think we should be going beyond just replacing the nitrogen production from natural gas to electricity, etc. But thinking about the production of nitrogen by nitrogen fixation. I think there's a tremendous potential there, not just symbiotic nitrogen fixation, introducing legumes in the system, but the potential of non-symbiotic nitrogen fixation in the soil by bringing life back in the soil. The potential there is still vastly unexploited. When I studied soil science, was about soil physics and soil chemistry. There was no soil biology study, and it's really only in the last maybe 10 years that there is some significant progress in understanding what's happening in the soil, the life in the soil, and how it contributes to the sustainability and the efficiency of the whole system. So I think rethinking the whole system, not just in terms of substituting one inefficient technology with another one, but not changing the entire system, is not going to do the trick. I think it's really, as you mentioned also on the downside, the commercialization, the short value chains, it's all part of rethinking the entire system. And I think that's where we will have the real gains and win-wins. I also like that way of thinking about it, rather than just trying to replace one aspect by another. And I think that there's other aspects on what can be done to get us there, but maybe we'll be dealing with that a little bit later.
I of course also like the win-wins, but I think also just thinking about the history of the last 150 years, fossil fuels have enabled the lives that we have today. There's all sorts of upsides and downsides to that, but one of the major upsides, I would say, is you're using a lot less land to produce an efficient amount of food. There's significantly fewer labor costs when you're using farm machinery. You're able to, exploit larger pieces of land. Are we being too rosy in some of this picture? Rupert, do you have any thoughts on again these kind of trade-offs?
Well, I'll give an anecdote from a visit I made to Wisconsin last year, and we were talking with dairy farmers about diversification because they were experiencing more extreme weather events, and so could we sort of combine arable and dairy and the same piece of land. And I asked if that had ever been done before, and they said, well, 100 years ago, a lot of them were growing oats, and that was principally to power Chicago's transport system, because Chicago pre-1900 was largely powered by horses, and horses were powered by oats. So very large tracts of the Midwest were given over to oats. Now, Chicago, two things then happened. The Model T Ford came along, and so a lot of the transport system shifted to fossil fuels. And then the other thing happened was the electrification. So the horse-powered trams were replaced by electric-powered trams. It seems to me what's happened in the 20th century is that we went very, very far down the fossil fuel route and sort of ignored the electrification route. And the job of the 21st century is to close off the fossil fuel route and go much more heavily down the electrification route. But we shouldn't at the same time forget that in that transition, that earlier energy transition from powering Chicago with horses to powering it with Model T Fords and electric trams, the land that was no longer needed for oats could then be used to grow something else, which turned out to be corn and soy. And so it's the corn and soy is now powering biofuels, which are the current land use problem, especially in the US, that there's just vast amounts of land being given over to production of fuel and not to food. So I think all of these transitions come with sort of costs and benefits, and we need to sort of be quite hard-headed about the numbers associated with that. But I do come back to the sort of point of wider system change. If there's a more efficient technology that's plug and play, absolutely you have to do that. At the same time, you have to look for the sort of technologies that are not quite there yet. And they're not just sort of technologies in terms of automation or new crop varieties, but also behavioral technologies. So what can artificial intelligence do, for example, to improve farming practice or to improve sourcing practice by corporate supply chains so that less food is wasted along the way? Can AI be used to shorten the supply chains and connect farmers and buyers in a more efficient way locally so that you don't need as many processing steps? And so I think it is possible to create a more efficient and a significantly decarbonized world with a combination of technology, but also significantly practice and behavior change.
So I hope you're all thinking about what questions, experiences, things you want to share. We really do want to hear from you, and we'll, again, add your questions online in the live stream. I want to move before that to maybe a bit more of an optimistic, like what do we need in place? Not just the vision of this transition, but what supports need to be in place. So if we want to move to that direction, what do we need to do right now? So maybe Helen, we'll start with you from the farming perspective. What sort of different food system actors, what should be working on to help farmers right today?
Well, I guess, in the really big scheme of things, the thing that we need at the farm level and probably everywhere else as well is to make sure that we get the economics of the system right so that we are not subsidizing fossil fuels into the system. And if we're going to subsidize anything, we're subsidizing those greener energy systems that we want people to take up. Because if you get the big scale macroeconomics of this right and the right messages flowing through the system, then we will all find a way to make that work. But at the moment, the signals aren't right. We're still subsidizing fossil fuels, and we are not necessarily supporting in the same way the transition to green energy. So I do think that's something we've got to think about, and I almost hate to mention it in a farming audience, but we are still supporting red diesel, for instance, and I would rather that money was being put into supporting some of the rapid transition into green energy. I think when we're thinking about, is there a tension here, the land sparing, land sharing kind of debate that you've just raised, I think that developing the new models, I've got really interested over the last 20 years in agroforestry, for instance, and the use of perennial crops, because as somebody said earlier on, it's the ploughing and the sowing and all that kind of stuff that's creating such a lot of the energy requirement. And if you're looking at how do we actually maximize food production from an area of land, whilst also sequestering carbon and providing space for nature and all the benefits that trees and perennial crops bring into the landscape, then we can do a huge amount in that space, so that we don't have this trade-off between lower intensity farming, using less inputs, using less fossil fuels, and producing enough healthy food for everybody. So I think there's something we can really get into there. And obviously horticulture in the UK, you produce an awful lot of fruit and veg from a pretty small area of land, and yet we are still not focused on supporting the growing of those healthy crops. And if you combine that with a bit of new technology, some of the robotic ideas, you can manage much more complex environments. The reason we've gone down this route where we've ripped out all the hedges and made all our fields really big and compacted the ground is because we've needed to go to bigger and bigger tractors. If you can start to scale down and move to more autonomous vehicles on the land, you've got the opportunity to manage more complex environments that would be amazing in terms of food production and in terms of virtually everything else. So I think there's some really exciting stuff that can do here, but we've got to think a bit outside the box. It's not just about changing our current farming systems into a lookalike version that's got a slightly greener feel to it. It's about reshaping that and building on the green shoots that are coming through of the people who are experimenting with these novel systems and giving them the support and spreading that knowledge to others, because that's a really exciting future that can feed us healthily well and resolve a lot of the challenges we're facing.
And Emile, you're based in Brussels and you work with this global organization. What do you think are the right policy supports to help this transition? And also, if you can think of any successful examples that have already started to move us in this direction that we can point to.
I would say the first thing is also to get rid of all the perverse incentives. We heard about subsidizing red diesel, for example, but subsidies in general are still largely an incentive for a continued industrial model of agriculture, where you're just paid by hectare. Very little money is actually going to support a transformation towards more sustainable and resilient systems or agroecological systems. So redirecting the money that is being invested in agriculture in a way that helps the transformation is certainly a very important aspect. And the other thing is what else can be done to facilitate and accelerate the transformation towards diversified, sustainable, resilient agroecological systems that where there are examples of what can be done. And I think what we need is to really get to that tipping point where this model of more sustainable agriculture will become the norm. And I would hope that we won't have a continued industrial model that continues to function maybe slightly more efficiently, and then a smaller proportion that will really transform. I think we should really ambition to have a real transformation of the entire system, because that can work. Agroecological systems can work at large scale as well. It's just a different way of approaching. But we need these incentives to prime the pump, if you want, to get to that tipping point. And therefore, I think public procurement can be a very important incentive for supporting farmers that want to do the transformation. And I will give two examples. In Brazil, the first Lula, under the first Lula presidency, they had an important program that made it compulsory for all public procurement to have at least 40% of their procurement from agroecological farms, local agroecological farms. So it was working both on changing the way the food is produced, but also making these supply chains shorter. That really created an environment that allowed much of the small farms to really prosper and become more mainstream. The other example is at the local level. In Copenhagen, about 15 years ago, the mayor of Copenhagen wanted to see a shift towards to move towards 90% of all the food in public procurement, in feeding school programs, clinics, prisons, etc., to go to 90% organic produce being used there, and as much as possible locally. They did that transition in a period of 4 years within the same budget. And what was required there is simply a small reduction in the meat in the diets, in the meals that were served, a reduction in the meat proportion. And the second one is to use only seasonal products. With those two changes, they were able to go to 90% organic food at the same cost. So it's not it didn't involve any additional cost. So I think these are very concrete examples on how some policy decisions can create an environment to accelerate and allow the transformation to happen. So I think it is possible.
And Rupert, anything else you want to add or think about in terms of what are the immediate things that we should be working towards?
I love the Copenhagen example. I've sort of made a note of that to go and read up more if you can share more. I do think public procurement is an important lever, and the UK government is trying to roll out more school breakfasts and school lunches and reduce barriers to accessing those, and that would seem to be to me to be a great opportunity. And I think the political and economic climate we're in at the moment is that realistically companies are not going to do a lot of stuff voluntarily, and their investors, I'm sorry to say, are discouraging them from doing so. So we do have to look to regulation, and trying to get as much change as we can for the limited amount of subsidy that's available. Not to bribe the people to make the change, but to sort of tip the balance from people who are already looking to invest in the electrification technology or make large capital purchases that will allow them to drive down fossil fuel use, but to do so commercially, so that people are not going into debt for this. And I think the small amount of subsidy that remains in the UK system, and the slightly larger amount that remains in the EU system, does need repurposing in that way. We haven't talked about here today yet the sort of voluntary mechanisms where the sort of carbon markets and trying to drive change through more behavioural incentives. I'd love to hear if you have anything to say on this exchange concept there, Helen, because that seemed really interesting to me.
Yes, is that okay if I just... Solar Association Exchange is a way of measuring our environmental outcomes, including carbon footprinting, but also our social and animal welfare, so a holistic measurement framework. And one of the things that we've launched at the conference here this week is a pilot which has encouraged a bunch of those people whose Scope 3 emissions are coming from farming, so they may be food processors or retailers, but also banks or insurers, to come together to co-fund changes at the farm level which will reduce their carbon emissions. And so it's giving a lot of flexibility to farmers depending on where they're starting from to think about what are their next steps to reduce their carbon emissions, paying them a rate per tonne for doing that. It's open to arable farmers at the moment, but the hope is that we'll be able to scale this pilot into a much bigger fund, which will be able to support farmers from a whole range of different farming systems to make that transition transition to a lower carbon footprint, and to make sure, because it's very important, to bring in biodiversity and other things as well in the longer term. And I think that, because if we're thinking about how we're going to get farmers to make this transition, we're going to have to support them to do it. And at the moment, farmers are being tempted to sell their carbon off the farm, to sell offsets. And I'm very nervous about farmers. Very few of us are at net zero already, have got surplus carbon to sell. So insetting that feels like a much more tenable route to go down. And given that many actors are involved with any particular farm, for them to share the burden of supporting those farms to transition to a lower carbon future feels like the right way to shoulder this burden of transition that at the moment otherwise farmers are going to have to make on their own. So I'm very excited about exchange market as a new way of supporting those farmers that bring all those actors together in a cost-effective way for them, but in a way that should make a lot of difference to farmers' ability to invest in the things they need to invest in to be able to make those steps.
If you allow me, there's another dimension of how to help with the transition and support the transition, because as you mentioned, Helen, it is important to support the farmers with that transition. But we heard in the conference yesterday about the cost to our health system of the unsustained or the unhealthy food system we have today. And if a fraction of that cost to society was invested in helping with the transition, the savings we would be making on our health bill would be very significant. I think that's something where we need not just to think about carbon trading, but really shifting costs from a health sector towards a sustainable food system and supporting that system. That is, of course, a very difficult thing to do, because it's coming from different budgets, and even if here in the UK, DEFRA might want to support that transition to get the health ministry to be willing to pay for that, if you want, is a very, but I think it's something that we'll have to come to. And it's part of the broader thinking of true cost accounting. We can imagine the same thing from an environmental, the cost to society of the unsustainable way we are polluting the environment, etc. If those costs were incorporated in the entire accounting system of our food system, we would be able to support the transition in a much more efficient way. But that really requires a very ambitious rewiring of our political systems as well.
So,
Can I build on that, Matthew?
real quickly, because then I want to turn it over to the audience.
Well, just very, very briefly, it seems to me we repeatedly, as a society, sort of fall into the trap of not tackling problems at source and then spending more to mitigate them. So the sort of obesity crisis, we haven't tackled that at the source of the quality of food. So we're going to end up tackling it through anti-obesity drugs, which are going to be more expensive and quite painful. You know, we haven't tackled climate change at source, and the result is wildfires that are sort of wiping out chunks of LA, which will cost vastly more to rebuild than actually tackling electrifying the transport system and clearing the brush and the surrounding forests would have done. So repeatedly, I feel we just sort of sleepwalk into situations where you have to pay more to clean something up than mitigating in the first place. So I just try and approach it with that mindset to say, what is going to be how can we prevent the thing from occurring in the first place?
That's a good point. So we'd love to hear from you. We've got questions coming in from online. We have Jackie and Robbie with microphones. We also have a microphone up in the balcony. So please, raise your hand if you have questions. We have covered different parts of the value chain. We have full podcast episodes on all of these topics if you want to dive in and learn more. But we want to hear from you. Maybe we could start with some farmers in the room. If we could just collect a few farmers who might have some questions that are specific to the fossil fuel transition on farming. In the green jumper.
Hello, thank you. Very interesting. So I have a farm that used to be a mixed farm, half arable, and now it is all pastoral, and I raise ruminants on it because I thought that it would be better not to be producing grain and using fossil fuels to produce that grain and the tillage, and instead to be capturing carbon, promoting biodiversity, and producing high-quality organic meat through beef and sheep. And yet I find constantly this issue of methane being raised. And do you think there should be more distinction between methane produced not by the fossil fuel industry or landfill, but from ruminant meat production with all its benefits, and that it should be understood that this isn't something to be penalised, but it is a short-term climate gas, which of course avoids things like compacted soil and nitrous oxide production. So I'm interested in the analysis of methane as a carbon footprint, because, you know, my farm actually has a very high carbon footprint, even though we have many days when we are fossil fuel-free farming.
Thank you for the question. I think that's a really interesting thing about when you center the fossil fuel lens as opposed to some other concerns, how does that change the equation? I want to take one more question and then I'm going to group them together. Perhaps on this side of the room.
Hello, thank you. Helen Browning said that, quite rightly, that to mention pricing diesel in line with other fossil fuels would be very unpopular with farmers if red diesel was the same cost as other diesel. And of course that's true, and it's also true that the exemption from the plastics tax, which agriculture enjoys, would be unpopular to get rid of. And it's even more true that the incoming fertilizer tax will be very unpopular with agriculture as a whole, not necessarily with organic farmers, but with the vast majority of agriculture. So my question to the panel is it not the case if agriculture throughout the world had to pay proper prices for fossil fuels, that farmers might actually be better off, not worse off? But the real problem is the fear of being undercut by production from other countries, and therefore should carbon border adjustment mechanisms include food and agricultural produce? Sorry, that's a bit complicated, but I hope that made sense. Thank you.
So if any of the panel wants to jump in on either of those questions, the first one being on a organic, very low fossil fuel farm and how these think about methane accounting, specifically around ruminants as opposed to methane more broadly. And the other question is again on, I think these metrics in accounting and what their impacts on for farmers. And please, Helen, do you want to jump in?
I'll have a go, but I'm sure that Rupert will have a lot to say about the methane question as well. I mean, that was exactly indeed what I was trying to reflect at the beginning, because we have a lot of ruminants too, and therefore the methane is by far the biggest climate impact that we have on the farm. It makes the fossil fuels look quite small, and the danger is that you take your eye off the fossil fuels because actually it's dwarfed by the methane challenge. I think the challenge with methane, without wanting to completely pronounce on how it should be treated, is that it's a short-term gas, but it's also a very immediate lever, and one of the few levers that we have in terms of reducing climate impacts fairly quickly. Because so I think whatever the rights and wrongs of the way we treat it over time, I can understand why folk are turning to it and saying this is something which could make a difference in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, rather than over the decades that it takes to bring down levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But that is challenging, and I guess what is really important in terms of if you're looking at it at a farm level or at a UK level, it's the trajectory of methane that's key. Every time we add more ruminants into the mix, we are making a fairly rapid acceleration. But if you hold your numbers of ruminants static or gently bring them down very slightly at a farm or a national level, you are having, because it's a short-term gas, you're able to bring that back under control quite quickly. So I don't know what the right way to deal with this is. It is a complicated one because it's a short-term gas, but it is going to be right in the public eye because it is also a very short-term lever.
You replace it with. If you're not getting that protein and fat from ruminants, how are you going to...
So I would suggest, I take into account we've got one field which used to graze a few sheep, and now we have 30 different species of fruits and nuts and soft fruit, and we're producing about 500 times more food on that 10-acre field, and a lot more protein, because nuts, actually, if you look at nut crops on a yield per acre basis, they outperform livestock quite dramatically.
I'm thinking of omega-3.
You can get quite a lot of your omega-3 from things like flaxseed. I love livestock, so I'm not making an anti-livestock point. I think there is an opportunity cost about livestock. We need to be thinking about that a bit. I think that livestock integrated into farming systems can work really well, but I don't think we should kid ourselves that it is the most efficient way to produce fat and protein, including omega-3. But I think that livestock in our farming systems have a role to play. Overall, it is about, we've been saying this as Soil Association for many years, it is about less but better. It is about reduction in consumption, but doing that in a pasture-based way that will improve the nutrient profiles and will not continue to accelerate some of the challenges like methane. This is incredibly complicated and tricky territory. But Rupert, you're the expert on this. Why don't you weigh in?
Well, I have a disclaimer. Unfortunately, my disclaimer is that I'm an economist, not a farmer, right? So I don't have the practical experience of this. I spend a lot of time looking at numbers. I'm just going to briefly touch on the second question about the sort of subsidy reforms and carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Because we worked on a report over the last 5 years, the Food System Economics Commission, in which we tried to tackle this question of what would a sort of optimized food system look like in terms of public support, and how would you repurpose the fertilizers to try and get to socially better outcomes. And a very significant part of that was shifting support from fossil fuel intensive practices such as nitrogen fertilizers and red diesel and black plastic and so on towards practices that are actually beneficial to the climate and nature and getting paid for those. And the short answer is that it does save the world money, and it produces more food, and it is sort of healthier. So it's a win-win-win. But as you say, in order to do that without people undercutting each other, you do need a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The EU deforestation regulations and the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism do together start to provide that, but it's going to be quite clunky and messy in implementation, particularly as the billionaires in Texas are now throwing stones at the whole trading system and at democracy and everything else. So this is going to be quite messy in how it is evolved and implemented, but I do think it will eventually happen. Just on the methane, I mean, you're getting to, I think, a very important question, and it's not just farming that has high methane footprint. The fossil fuel industry itself has a huge methane footprint. We launched about 5 years ago a small subsidiary company called Capterio, which works with oil and gas companies to cut the methane footprint. And the answer is that they are incredibly able to do so, actually. And oil and gas companies, including the frackers, who do not tackle their methane footprint, are essentially failing to do so out of a combination of laziness and sort of commercial self-interest. But there is no technological reason that you cannot drive the methane footprint of oil and gas production and transportation and trading down really, really far. And there's some very interesting new insights emerging into the trade-offs that are associated with using natural gas. When the Scottish government 10 years ago commissioned new ferries for the West Coast, they commissioned dual fuel ferries that could run either on diesel or on liquefied natural gas. It turns out the liquefied natural gas has just the same carbon footprint as the diesel, because even though it is more efficient and produces less CO2, natural gas actually boils off the LNG as it is being run. So it doesn't actually save the planet at all. And because you're getting methane rather than CO2, the methane is in the atmosphere for longer, but it is 40 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas. So you get a lot of warming in a short space of time. And the answer for shipping fuel is more about methanol and ammonia and other fuels that can be made by electrolysis. Until the point that we have batteries that are good enough to power ships with. For the on-farm methane, I think obviously we need better accounting, but I'm also very interested in technologies for reducing methane on farm. I'm interested in people's views here on whether they are or interested in using Bovaer or other supplements and how they feel about the backlash to that. But I'm also interested in people's experiences of digestion. Colleague in California has been attending a number of meetings at UC Davis, who are a leader in developing large-scale digestion facilities, which the Californian dairy farms have done over the last 10 years to almost completely cut out methane from manure. So they have very large farms, they have very large digesters, and the methane footprint from manure is more or less gone to zero. Now, obviously that is only going to work in that system because the dairy farms are so large. The animal welfare and the food quality implications of that are not ones I would suggest importing to Europe, but is there something in the digestion technology, and are there ways to have smaller farms share digesters or to downscale the technology so that it works at a smaller scale? Because that is half the problem, and the other half is the enteric fermentation, which is harder, and that requires scientists to feed into.
I think I'm going to go on to the next one. But yeah, I think messy and complicated is a good way to describe a lot of these challenges. And I'll just plug that tabledebates.org. We have a few different explainers on methane that don't pick a side or anything, but really unpack the complexity of these issues. So we have some questions from online.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in a couple of questions from online. We've got several, but I'm going to share. There's one question from Daniel, which is about the potential to substitute plastic in polytunnels and mulch matting and crop fleeces and other elements of fossil fuel use in horticulture. I think we haven't really talked about plastics on the farm, so I think that's an interesting question. And there's another question from George about going electric on farm. So far, so George is a farmer who is gradually going electric, but so far not including an electric tractor. Do the panel think that most farms could electrify, including generating via renewables? That's two from online, and should we take one more from the room as well?
One more from... Yeah, 1 second.
Sorry, wait for the microphone.
For the microphone.
Hello. Nobody's mentioned human muscle power. There are 10 million people signed up to gyms. There are thousands of people who do marathons. They produce absolutely nothing. I have done calculations that show that of all these people, if they were given the scythe and shown how to use it, they could mow all our silage fields and all our hay fields in one day, right? Now, you may think I'm off with the fairies a bit, but actually, in places like India and the third world, loads of people still do use muscle power. They need to improve their performance, to be competitive with fossil fuels. Somebody who's cutting their harvest with a sickle could be doing it with a scythe, or they could be doing it with a small fossil-fueled harvester, right? If they do it with a scythe, they're going to treble their performance, and it's going to cost them very little. If they try to do it with a fossil fuel power machine, they're quite likely to get priced out. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a lot of a movement about intermediate technologies of this kind. We don't hear it any longer. The Intermediate Technology Group now calls itself Practical Action. Is there still a place for human muscle power and for intermediate technologies?
Great, thank you. So we have 3 questions, all farm related. The first one on plastics on the farm around polytunnels. The second one on electric tractors or other electrification of the farm. And the third one on getting all the people who run marathons to do some work and sweat on farms and intermediate technologies. Who would care to start there?
Are you looking at me?
Let's start there, Helen, and then it makes sense that the farmer would start, and then Emile, you can please follow.
Okay, so yeah, I think some of the uses of plastic are quite hard to work out how we get out of them, things like polytunnels. But things like mulching, we've moved to wood chip as a very, very effective mulch, which also has huge benefits for crop growth. I think some of the challenges around things like silage, moving to hay, actually, where you don't need plastic wrapping. So there are things that we can do to reduce plastic usage. I'm a little bit worried about always demonizing plastic, because I think it's the way we recycle and handle it that is often the big issue. Sometimes when you move to things like glass as packaging, it's so much heavier, the transport cost gets greater. So I think we need to have a clear-eyed view of plastic, and it's about that whole life cycle of plastics that I think we need to be thinking about a bit more. Moving to all glass houses rather than polytunnels might not have the environmental impact that we want it to have. Anyway, there's some stuff we can do. I don't know that it's all sorted. In terms of the electric tractors, I think it's, we've touched on this a little bit already. In a way, it's not going to happen until we've sorted out larger scale lorry, all the other infrastructure where we're moving stuff around the place, and the battery challenge. And I wonder whether electrification is the route for farm machinery, or whether things like we talked about just now about methane capture, whether this cryogenically freezing methane down into a gas might not be a more farm appropriate way to be driving farm machinery. So I think we really need to evaluate emerging technologies and think about what is going to be right at the farm level. But I don't think we're going to be able to crack it at the farm level until we crack it more widely in society for lorries and stuff. And yeah, I love a bit of muscle power. On our small scale horticulture, that's largely what it's about. But anyway, I think that's fun to think, getting more people out of the gym and onto doing a bit of work.
Emile?
Well, I think just thinking about permaculture as a model of really using muscle power, because it generally doesn't involve any fossil fuel use, and still allows very high production. But I'd like to mention also, we are talking about decarbonizing. We must also, if we look at it globally, beyond the UK now, we must also think about not carbonizing things that are decarbonized today. There's a lot of investment in development programs that try to bring mechanization into areas that actually don't ask for it. Yesterday I heard somebody citing Ibrahima Coulibaly, who is a farmer organization leader in West Africa, and he said, we don't need a tractor, all we need is a donkey and a carol behind it. This is what we are asking, but often big development programs come in with tractors that we have no use for, and which after a few years starts rusting in a corner because there's no maintenance for it. So I think in development programs we must also think about not going the route that led us to where we are today, where we have to decarbonize, but let's start by looking for options that don't carbonize to start with.
Do reduce some of the drudgery. that whole thing about,
the donkey is helping with that.
Exactly.
I'll just add too from our episode on processing plastics and transport. Emma Priestlin from the Break Free from Plastic advocacy group, she was talking about having a plastic budget, where we think about what are the appropriate uses, right? We're using it basically everywhere we can find because it is cheaper, more durable. It is really efficient. I called it the duct tape of farming. You can really use it for anything. But there are, with all of these things, we're not saying let's go to zero immediately. There are some really important uses. So can we identify them and make a budget around them to say what is an appropriate amount? And I think that's an interesting way to think about how we don't make this really tough for people in the process. Do we have other questions from? Oh yeah, Rupert, please.
An example of that, and to build on Emile's point about sort of go to the clean technology without the sort of fossil fuel detour. About 15 years ago, I worked in Liberia as an advisor to the Ministry of Agriculture, and one of the field visits we took was to a village deep in the rainforest where people were growing rice. And it was very gendered. So the men would clear the bush, and then most of the planting, seeding, and transplanting was done by women. But actually, the most backbreaking job was not the weeding, but the processing of the rice. So the de-hulling, which was done by women in a pestle and mortar, and they got me to do it, and my arms felt like they couldn't move after about 10 pounds. So I went into looking into how you can automate and just sort of de-muscle labor that process in order to free them up to do other things. And the preferred technology by far was a diesel-powered rice mill. And they were expensive and they broke down a lot. But what's happened in the last 15 years is that diesel generators in off-grid villages are rapidly being replaced by low-cost solar kits. And initially it was just for charging phones, and then it was for powering lights, and they're now getting more, because of batteries, they're getting more powerful, and you can start using them for things like rice mills. So that technology is really advancing. And yes, I think draft animals is an important and often overlooked part of the solution, especially in East Africa. And I'm with Helen on not demonizing plastic, and sort of there's a right way and a wrong way to use plastic, and the tax system doesn't always perhaps encourage the right way at the moment.
I think those are all helpful, interesting examples to kind of contrast against each other. So we've got some questions more from the audience. I'd love to also get anyone who has listened to the podcast and has questions, but we can just take a few. Robbie, if you want to bring one over here. Yeah, please.
Hello, thank you. I'm Richard Gadlett. I farm in Wiltshire, organic farmer. Slightly different question. There's a military term, hearts and minds, and it springs to mind. There's been mention of investors investing in the wrong things, perhaps, and we have, we're in a market economy. Our customers are making choices all the time. How do we change those hearts and minds? And I'm not thinking about people in this conference, obviously, who perhaps are already aligned in hearts and minds and even spirit. How do we get hearts and minds to change so that people are buying the right things, but also investing, particularly in pension funds, perhaps?
So we got a question around investment. We'll take one or two more. Yeah, Jackie.
Hi. We're talking about plastics. I find it quite ironic and also hilarious because has anyone looked at how much plastic there is in a wind turbine and a wind mast? You've got about the equivalent of 70,000 plastic straws, 700 gallons of fossil fuels for the engine. If you look at where the minerals are being stolen from Africa, so we can have a Green New Deal here, forests have been strip mined. I don't remember letting any of these companies to go green come into my land and deforest it. So we're demonizing fossil fuels to do a transition to renewables, which is fully reliant on burning fossil fuels. How did that happen? That is the biggest Ponzi scam on the global south to rip up their forests, demonize them, sell it to us as green, And then we're going to say we're going to do systems change. If we're going to do systems change, then the whole panel should be a mixture of African, South American, and Indian. What really pisses me off is people think they are entitled to these resources, and then they think they're also entitled to be the only ones who actually supposedly do anything for us. There's nothing plastic-free. Your solar panels are full of conflict minerals. They've got blood of Africans all over it. So let's start talking about what the Global South talks about but never says in the UK, which is this green transition, which is for the World Economic Forum to screw over the farmers and then basically dress up as something so virtuous and green. I'm fed up of it. We need to start talking about this plastic-loaded solutions, which is ripping up most of the Global South. When are we going to start talking about that and sticking to these comfortable conversations where it's complete nonsense?
Yeah. So we'll take one more question, but I do just want to say on this point, the podcast does include voices from the Global South that we talk about this quote, green energy transition, and what does that mean? And we speak to activists from Western Africa who are confronting what this means in their communities and have these exact same fears, concerns of this potential reality. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that. And we'll take one more question.
Life's very complicated. I'm an arable farmer mixed, and I'm trying to make it simple for myself. And making it simple, I measure birds every day because I've got to work with my staff and visitors. And so I measure average number of birds heard per day. And that's my key measure. I know now what it is for the day, and next week I'll know what it is. What measure should we be using to measure our journey so that I can share it with people so they know where I am today and where I'm going to be next week? So what's the single measure that can be measured real time?
Okay, so we've got three. This grouping is not as neatly grouped. Does any one of the panelists want to jump in on any of those questions or any of those points?
Maybe on the last one about measuring, it's true that in agriculture, the measure of success has been essentially yield per hectare of a major crop. And I think we should really start rethinking about what matters to society, what should we be aiming at, rather than this abstract tons per hectare. And that should take into consideration things like the impact on health, the more societally matter, things that matter, and start rethinking the metrics. And there again, the concept of true cost accounting is helping to identify those things that we should actually be measuring. So I don't want to go too far in detail on that, but I think that's an important thing that we should be keeping in mind.
Just on that front, I think we've been doing a lot of work at the Soil Association. We talked about Soil Association Exchange earlier on, which is exactly an attempt to try and come up with what are the simplest, most cost-effective, most meaningful things that we need to measure, and how do we do that measurement in a way that creates a more industry approach or a sector-wide approach so that we're comparing apples with apples. And we've had a great science panel who's been advising on that, inspired also by the Global Farm Metric approach, which is quite big and complicated. We're trying to make it a little bit more simpler and doable. So do have a look at that if that's helpful. We're certainly keen to work with people who want to measure stuff. Just going back to the point about investors, I think I'm really nervous about the way it's been quite exciting to see money moving into this area, a lot of interest in this area, but it's pretty clear that money will want the same return that it's always had, and that is going to be quite, even if it wants to dress that up into a slightly greener set of clothing, and I'm nervous about the way that money will need to hook onto certain types of technology in order to make those kind of returns. It's very hard to get investment into the knowledge-rich but probably quite low-tech approaches that a lot of us in this room are probably working on. That's not an anti-tech statement. It's just saying actually a lot of what we need is better knowledge and better farming systems and shortening supply chains where actually there's less money to be made rather than more. So I think it is a challenge with investment and trying to find the model that will allow that money to come in. That's where some of the carbon markets and things may have potential. But again, I'm nervous about the way we start to trade these things in a way that can have some potentially dangerous consequences further down the line. And I just want to acknowledge, I really hear the point about the way our green revolution is going through the same destruction and sort of challenges that our industrial system went through. I think we really need to recognize that and think about how do we build a just transition in that works across the globe. I don't have the answers to any of this, but I really hear what you said.
Thank you. Just a few builds. So one, I mean, there are of course costs to mining the minerals, the green transition, and so on. Fossil fuels, of course, are also hugely expensive and costly, and the way that they're mined and produced is also falling overwhelmingly on the producer countries, not the consuming countries. You know, the fracking is not happening here. The Niger Delta is exporting to Europe, and the costs stay in the Niger Delta, none of the benefits do. So I think the existing system is already deeply unequal and unfair in that sense. But how to green the new system so that doesn't replicate the destruction. So one example we're working on is battery recycling. So rather than strip mining Indonesia, which is where most of the nickel comes from for making batteries, or DRC for the cobalt, how can you recycle the batteries in cars, or use car batteries that are no longer suitable for use in cars as stationary energy storage batteries? And there's quite a lot of promise in that, and there are some credible estimates that suggest that we will reach peak battery in the 2030s, which is the point at which, although we continue to increase the share of global power supply that is electrified and that is stored in batteries, we don't need to carry on mining because we can recycle and reuse the batteries that are already there. One last point on the hearts and minds, which I heard, I'm not sure we've fully responded to. It seems to me that the number one driver of consumer buying behavior is still, when you look at the data, price, followed by health and environmental concern. For most people, although they will express it in surveys, very rarely shows up in buying patterns. And when it does, it is in the things that you can see on the label. So has it been air freighted and so on, rather than necessarily what is its carbon footprint. And so I think that the two things that most effectively change customers' hearts and minds is if the supply chain gets the economics right, so that the healthy food is not dramatically more expensive than the unhealthy food. And a lot of that for me is about seasonality and about shortening supply chains. And the second is to make sure that we get clearer on and improve our science and understanding of the health benefits of food that has been grown well and not ultra processed. And I think once we've got more of that evidence and we get clearer on those health benefits, it will be easier to make the case that sometimes you have to pay more for it.
So we are nearing the end of our time, but maybe we'll take one more question. If anyone feels like they have a good wrapping up question, we got a hand that just jotted up here. So,
thank you so much for a very interesting panel. I'm reminded of the old joke about asking for directions and being told, "Well, I wouldn't start from here." So my question is to ask each of the panelists to imagine that they were starting from scratch and tell us what the ideal food system for the UK would look like for them.
And if you could do that in a minute each. whoever feels brave enough to give it a crack, and then maybe you could build on each other's.
Go first.
I'm an economist, so I will continue to insist on the benefits of trade as long as there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism baked into it. But actually, the biggest change I would make in my ideal food system is that I would get a lot, or go back to perhaps seasonality, and I would also make a lot more of domestic legume and nut production, because there are delicious high protein, high fat products that can be produced by plants that are very possible to produce in this climate and are very healthy, but we are not producing, and we are importing animal feed that is implicated in deforestation instead. So my biggest changes would be on what we eat, actually, and I would keep trading, but I would do so with CBAMs.
Helen.
Well, I go with that. One of the things that always interests me is how do we demonetize the food system to a degree, and how can we plumb in more food that is available to people for free everywhere? How do we enable more people to forage, or to have more community orchards, or just to, I would say, whenever you plant a hedge, just put a fruit tree in every 10 meters, because it's always there. How do we make more food more available for nothing to people? Because farming, much as we love it, and I'm lifelong as a farmer, does have massive impacts, and actually food. Can we think about food in a slightly different way as to how it is genuinely a public good that everybody can access some of in their own environment as part of their day-to-day life, rather than it all being bought through shops? And so food for free is what I'm interested in.
Emile.
I think a real agroecological transformation of the entire system that involves diversification, shorter supply chains, certainly growing more of the things that are consumed here locally. I think while trade should not be banned, I think we are relying too much on trade today. And so I think re-domesticating a lot of our food system would be an important way forward for me.
Well, I want to thank all of you for helping me with my job in this whole second half of the session. I want to thank the panelists, Rupert Simons of Systemic, Helen Browning of Soil Association, Emile Frison of IPES Food, and all the many hands and organizations that went into the making of this podcast series. For those who haven't listened, you could check it out on all the platforms. It's called Fuel to Fork. You can follow our work at tabledebates.org. And one more shout out to the amazing sound engineer who also made a physical presence here, Adam Titmus, for helping us throughout. And you'll be able to hear a recording afterwards in crisp quality, thanks to Adam. So a big round of applause for all the panelists and everyone involved.